It was 2001. I was attending a neighborhood potluck at the local park with my wife and our newborn son. Our friends were elated upon learning we'd had our first, and would be meeting Ashton for the first time that day. Everyone fussed over him and the adorable circular birthmark beneath his left eye, debating which of us he looked more like, and how excited their kids were to have a new friend. There were about a dozen of us that occupied 3 picnic tables. We had 3 or 4 coolers, a whole spread of different platters and trays that covered an entire table, along with burgers and dogs cooking on 2 charcoal grills. My cross-street neighbor, Fred, grilled, while everyone else talked, drank, and played games. Ashton lay in his carriage, which I parked in the shade of an oak tree next to the grills. I kept Fred company while he cooked, acting as a sort of sous chef and making sure his drink was always full. The park was particularly busy, and despite everything going on, I spotted someone who appeared to be watching our group, sitting alone at a picnic table about 10 yards from our spot. His clothes were sketchy, black pants and a heavy-looking hoodie that obscured his face. They were so uncharacteristic for a midday barbecue and made him very noticeable. The hooded man sat facing us with his arms folded across the table. I pointed him out to Fred, who acknowledged that something seemed off, but thought he appeared harmless. "Maybe he's meeting someone," I suggested, while pouring Fred a beer. Without any discretion, Fred turned and stared directly at the man. "Could be," Fred said, with disinterest, while flipping a few burgers. "Maybe he got stood up. We'll fix him a plate and make him feel a little better." I rolled my eyes at Fred's remark, unable to resonate with his unapologetic apathy. I couldn't ignore my instincts that were telling me this guy was here for another reason. Nobody else seemed to notice or mind him, and I didn't want to put a damper on the gathering, so I kept quiet about my apprehension. Despite being unable to see much of his face, I definitely felt the man's looming gaze briefly lock onto mine for a few minutes. After convincing myself he didn't have any good intentions, I decided to confront this particular individual. "Let me see what's up with this guy," I said softly to Fred. "It's those newfound parental instincts kicking in," Fred said. "They get a little wonky at first, just FYI. I started towards the man's table, but froze upon hearing an ear-splitting crack, a booming of shattering glass, and a crunching of metal. Everyone in the park stopped and stared at the parking lot, where a large tree limb had broken and smashed 2 cars. "The hell!" Fred exclaimed, as he set his spatula down and raced towards the scene. The tree limb had fallen onto Fred's car, which mine was parked next to, and partly covered by the massive branches. Throwing my arms up in the air, I released a "what the hell" of my own and followed behind Fred. Rachel was already assessing our cars when I arrived, shuddering upon spotting a few good-sized scratches and dents and a windshield crack. I expected Rachel to be as equally upset. Instead, she gave me a perplexed stare. "Where's the baby?" she quickly asked. I immediately pivoted, instantly noticing the hooded man had left his table and was beelining towards the grill. I broke into an all-out sprint upon determining the hooded man was after Ashton, releasing a boisterous "Hey!" that I hoped would deter him and get others' attention. What happened next took a matter of seconds, but felt like it unraveled in slow motion. The hooded man, wearing thick padded gloves, removed one of the grill's metal grates and grabbed its side handles. He turned to me once more before lifting the grill and dumping the red-hot coals into the carriage. A loud, hiss-like sizzle mixed with my baby's shrill, blood-curdling shriek, his screams only lasting 2 or 3 seconds before the carriage burst into flames. Grabbing handfuls of my hair, I reached Ashton's carriage. I could only scream his name and instantly knocked the stroller over with a firm kick. Glowing coals charred the blankets and pillows, and Ashton's smoldering remains spilled out, most of which were still on fire. The hooded man took off across the field while being pursued by Fred and 2 others. I could instantly tell that my baby was dead, whose stiff, crumpled form was completely doused in flames and produced a burnt, meaty aroma that filled my nostrils. I heard my wife's hysterical screams behind me, and I felt my legs give out as I collapsed in a heap. Rachel was inconsolable. She had to be sedated by the paramedics. I faded in and out, with most of time being between witnessing Ashton's murder and being taken to the hospital. It all felt like a blur. While waiting for an update on my wife, an officer came up to me and said they had caught the hooded man who initially escaped the park. I was brought to the police station, where I first laid eyes on him through a one-way mirror. He sat in an interrogation room. The man's appearance was grotesque, and he had appalling physical deformities. His skin was a light pinkish beige and littered with veiny, blotchy gray and black growths. He was completely hairless and had dark yellow eyes, whose right one was about twice the size of his left. I was met with repulsion and a boiling fury while gazing upon this murderous subhuman life form, whose windpipe I yearned to crush with my bare hand. After confirming I did not recognize him, detectives told me that he was being classified as a John Doe. The hooded man had no form of identification, wasn't showing up on any of the databases, and hadn't spoken a word. After getting assured that he wouldn't be released anytime soon, they asked a few more questions before letting me go, promising to provide updates on new developments. I returned to the hospital, where Rachel was still being treated for severe mental breakdown. I spent the night in the waiting room, mostly with my face buried in my cupped hands, replaying the day's grisly, life-altering events in my head. At some point I dozed off, and was awoken the next morning by a nurse. She brought me to the doctor caring for Rachel, who said my wife was in a deep state of catatonia. After being updated on Rachel's condition, I returned home to start arranging Ashton's services. No sooner than taking 3 steps out of the hospital, however, I was stopped by the same officer who'd brought me to the police station yesterday. He looked distraught, and I could tell he was dreading what he was about to tell me. "He's gone," the officer said sorrowfully. "Who's gone?" I asked with bewilderment. "The man who killed your baby. He somehow escaped last night. No witnesses, nothing on the camera, no sight of how. He was in his cell one minute and just gone the next." The hooded man was never found. Rachel made little progress overcoming her debilitating trauma, spending the next year in and out of psychiatric care. My life consisted of work, visiting her at the hospital, and going to bed. 2 months passed, during which things continued to gradually implode. Rachel returned home, but was on a cocktail of meds that barely seemed to help. She became a bitter, hostile shell of her former self, barely capable of functioning independently, and prone to sporadic fits of rage, delirium, or emotional episodes. Rachel blamed me for our baby's death, and made it her mission to keep me constantly reminded. I reached my breaking point with Rachel when she used a broken bottle to attack me during one of her episodes, slicing my arm and neck, which required over a dozen stitches. After that, Rachel was put into the mental care facility, and I decided to explore my legal options for ending our marriage. She could be looked after by her family, I thought. Most of them also hated and blamed me for Ashton's death anyway, even saying I was responsible for Rachel's mental breakdown. My boss's wife connected me with a divorce attorney to look at my case. When I met him at his office, however, he said something that took me completely off guard. "I've actually been expecting you, Mr. Williard," the attorney said while rummaging through his desk. "I have something here with instructions that I'm to give you on the 1st of September, which is today." He slid a yellow manila envelope in front of me, which had my name in large black letters. Inside was a light gray envelope that also had my name handwritten on it in red ink. "Who did it come from?" I asked awkwardly. "I only spoke to him twice. 1 year ago when he initially called, and then last night when he reminded me about today. He just identified himself as Mr. Doe. Sent me a large wad of cash to hold this for him, and that was that. Didn't ask any questions. That's sometimes how it goes in my business." The envelope's letter contained a vertical list of numbers, with other sets of digits, words, or letters beneath each one. The manila envelope held a white CD with "Watch in Order" written across its surface. I didn't even accomplish what I had come there to do originally, becoming completely sidetracked by this mysterious package. I ran the CD on my computer, which had a handful of video files labeled 1 through 5, remembering the disc said, "Watch in order." I opened the first file, and my heart stopped when the video began playing. Appearing on the screen was the deformed face of my baby's killer. The man who murdered my baby sat in a concrete room, wearing the same heavy hoodie and black stretch pants as he had that day. I would have pulled my computer off the desk and thrown it across the room if the shock of seeing his hideous face hadn't numbed me into a state of borderline paralysis. After fiddling with the camera, the hooded man leaned back and stared intently into the lens. "I'm so sorry, Jeremy," he said in a low, gruff voice, causing sharp chills to race down my spine when he spoke my name. "I really am so very sorry for everything, but you must understand why this happened. Let me start from the beginning." I took a sharp breath and struggled to maintain my composure, but felt compelled to continue watching. "My name obviously isn't Mr. Doe. It's Eric, and I'm from the year 2076. I know that sounds absurd, but you have something that will prove I'm telling the truth, which I'll cover in a little bit." The man, who identified himself as Eric, leaned closer towards the camera. "You know this was for a greater good, and doing this actually saved countless lives." I leaned back and stared skeptically at the computer screen, my intensifying hatred for this man clashing with the queasy uneasiness ushered in when he admitted to being the Mr. Doe from whom I received the package. "Okay, now that I've got your attention, here's where it gets complicated," Eric continued. "Some years from now, I can't get into specifics, a catastrophe is going to occur that devastates the world. Among the most adverse ramifications are a series of physical mutations that a portion of the population will undergo. As you can clearly see," Eric gestured toward his deformed face, "were known as defects and require special treatment to stay alive, like routine radiation doses and staying within certain temperature ranges, just to mention a few. Cases of radiation contamination and new disease outbreak originating from defects turn us into pariahs. This is where your son comes in. During these times, we call Ashton Williams the Demaciant. He was a renowned public figure whose faction quickly rose to power in the Cataclysm's aftermath, feeding off people's manipulatable emotions and fear. Seeking a scapegoat amidst their promise of rebuilding, the Demacia, as his minions are called, set their sights on the defects. They succeeded in generating enough widespread hatred amongst us, even going so far as to stage violent attacks and pinning us as the culprits. The video made me completely enraged. The Demaciant cited their attacks and our susceptibility to infect and contaminate people as grounds to start rounding us up into containment camps. We knew the risks we posed towards unaffected portion of the population and took great pains to isolate and care for ourselves. While researchers worked tirelessly to discover a cure, they actually came close, but the programs were discontinued without explanation. The camps had inhumane conditions. Many died from disease or malnourishment before the Demacia began extermination. The things they did would make history's most heinous figures cringe. You'll see what I mean when you watch the other files. I lost everything in those camps, Jeremy. Doing this was the only way to reverse that, and in the end, the Demaciant's oppressive reign. I felt a lump form in my throat and held back tears, simultaneously empathizing with Eric, while still reluctant to believe his stories. Your son was ravenous for power. The Demacia's evasively occupied territory, eventually starting a multinational war. They killed millions of defects, but those numbers pale in comparison to the tens of thousands of people who perished just in the war alone. A few tears streamed down Eric's face as he spoke. It It's okay to talk about what your son would have become, since that timeline is being eliminated. As for why I killed him in such a gruesome manner, doing it at that exact moment and way was the only option to stably alter the timeline. My heart sank when I recalled that fateful day, particularly when the tree limb fell on my car. It was the perfect distraction. Did Eric know that would happen? Did he change time to make that branch break, knowing how immediately it would occupy my attention? Jeremy, I know you're probably having a hard time believing this. I would too, but think about how I just vanished from my cell. I'd love to explain how it works, but it's against the rules to directly reveal certain information. That's why I sent you this. There's clues for events that will occur in the future, which will verify this is very real. Think of it as a puzzle. It's actually quite easy once you figure it out. There's some considerable time between each instance, but don't worry, I'll send you reminders. I know you're hurt, confused, and angry right now, but please believe me when I say a great loss or tragedy is sometimes necessary to prevent something much, much worse from happening. After the video ended, I stared at the computer for what felt like hours. Tearing, perspiring, and trembling, I had no idea what to believe. After collecting myself, I watched the other videos, which were compilations of newspaper clippings, excerpts from news broadcasts, and raw footage depicting scenes of war and unfathomable carnage. They seemed to map out everything Eric described, mentioning the cataclysm, the defects, the Demache rise to power, and their imperialistic campaign. Headlines such as, "Experts, recovery will take years, over 10K new mutation cases confirmed, link between defects and contamination outbreak identified," and "Demache completes southern coastal occupation," caught my eye, while videos and pictures flashed on the screen that Eric's words did little justice in describing. I saw images of war-torn horizons and crumbling city skylines, explosions, scores of marching fighting soldiers, along with dead and dismembered bodies. The most disturbing scene showed defects performing hard labor, rooms with their bodies and severed limbs hanging from meat hooks, mass executions and graves, even some getting their deformities cut off or experimented on while they were still conscious. It didn't take long for me to deduce a robust, prominent-looking man donning black authoritative uniforms and a long overcoat, who I saw clips of making fiery speeches, getting paraded around while waving to the crowd, speaking with officers, other official-looking individuals, and transported by armed security detail. It was my son. Despite having his mother's eyes, Ashton bore an overwhelmingly striking resemblance to me. But what verified my son's identity without a shadow of a doubt was the birthmark still visible beneath his left eye. Despite the macabre prospects of the future, I was intensely proud of my son, which I suppose comes natural for any parent, until reminding myself that he would have turned into a genocidal warlord whose totalitarian regime appeared to deepen the world's state of ruin. I stopped watching after one scene of Ashton making a passionate speech when I noticed an elderly man and woman sitting in the background. They were huddled together and gazed upon Ashton, their faces containing conflicted expressions of admiration and obligatory supportiveness, along with disappointment, concern, and dismay. My jaw dropped, and I released a gasp-like yelp before abruptly closing the video. Rachel and I were that elderly couple. Experiencing a wave of smothering lightheadedness, I tried pouring myself a drink, only to violently regurgitate it while standing over the sink. Those videos looked so genuine, and I hated how everything Eric said was making sense. Had my son really been destined to become this monstrous tyrant? Was this some elaborate sadistic prank a deranged individual was orchestrating to gain pleasure at the expense of my suffering? I tried thinking of every conceivable explanation to not believe, but I couldn't be convinced. My attention shifted to the notes, series of numbers that meant nothing upon review. Remembering what Eric said, to think of it as a puzzle, I looked at the first set of characters. 9, 112, 1, 11, 77, 175, 93. "What are you trying to tell me?" I asked. "This must be something more to this." About 1 week later, I received an identical light gray envelope in the mail. It contained a handwritten letter, also in red ink, that simply read, 9112001, just reminding you. I spent weeks trying to crack the cryptic code, which consumed me for months to no avail. It would take me over 3 years to finally figure it out, when the next letter arrived. After finalizing my divorce with Rachel, I moved back to my home state and reconnected with an old high school sweetheart. We got engaged, were starting our own company, and in the process of purchasing a house. I was grateful to finally move on with my life, but despite getting closure on Ashton's death, I still kept the undecipherable letters. Christmas was 5 days away, and I returned home from gift shopping where I found another light gray envelope lying on my doormat. Despite immediately knowing what it was, the envelope's mere sight flooded my mind with memories of Ashton's screams, his burning carriage, and Eric's undeniable face. I shakingly opened the envelope to find another letter, which read, 12-262-004. "Do you believe me yet?" On the first letter, written 12-262-004, were the numbers 75891. This time around, however, I was more concerned Eric knew where I lived than solving this mystery. I was about to dial 911, but remembered when Eric said that he was sending me reminders and decided to play along, feeling certain this letter was the latest. I figured everything out on the date later, ironically while writing a final check to my divorce lawyer. It was the day after Christmas, and I had the news on while paying some bills. They were talking about a massive earthquake and tsunami that devastated coastal communities around the Indian Ocean. I was so distracted by the story, I almost put the comma of the check's numerical amount in the wrong spot. While stopping myself, I looked at the check's date, which read December 26th, 2004. Remembering I was anticipating something significant to happen, I grabbed the open letter and stared closely at the numbers. 12-262-004. Thinking about the mistake I almost made on the check, I rewrote the figure and shifted the second comma 1 digit to the left, so it read 12-26-2004. I did the same with the top number, going from 9112001 to 9/11/2001, which was when it became clear. They were dates. It was something the news anchor said that I happened to hear. The earthquake registered a 9.1 on the Richter scale. That drew my stare to the number beneath, 12-26-2004, which were 758 and 91. Then it came to me. 9-1 signified the earthquake's magnitude. I learned the quake happened at 7:58 a.m. local time, which I linked to the other number, 758. Solving 9112001 figures was even more unsettling. The date it translated to was obvious, and after doing some research, I deduced the other figures represented the first number of each aircraft involved. I started shaking when the reality of the revelation hit me, almost having a serious breakdown when I couldn't fathom any other way that Eric or whoever it was could have known this information. My perception of reality, space, and time was turning upside down, marking a day which forever changed my life. I still resent Eric for killing my baby, and I will always keep Ashton's memory alive, because I remember him as an adorable, innocent child who hadn't hurt or wronged a single soul. Having said that, I finally understand what Eric meant. I translated the last 3 numbers, 34-2-0112. became March 4th, 2012. 842,020 turned into August 4th, 2020. And 4,132,029 was April 13th, 2029. Despite the tragic nature of the events that already happened, I understood why Eric chose them specifically. They mostly happened by pure chance and could not have been predicted or prevented. Having said that, I've spent the last 15 years making vain efforts at determining what happens on each of those dates before the event unfolds, with hopes of preventing the tragedy. As expected, I received my next letter over 7 years later in a late winter of 2012. 342,012. I know you don't need the reminders anymore, but I sent this one just in case, was what it read. Under 342,012 on the original letter, I received over a decade ago, 700 UTC and capital were written. On March 4th, 2012, a series of deadly explosions caused by an arms dump rocked Brazzaville, capital city of the Republic of the Congo. The blast started around 8 a.m. local time, which translated to 7 o'clock Coordinated Universal Time, otherwise known as UTC. That made sense. The most recent event happened this past summer. The next letter arrived the last week of July, which said 842,020. See you soon. Don't do anything stupid. I'll be watching. I obsessed over this and what it might mean, unsure how it pertained to the next event I expected to occur on August 4th. Beneath 842,020 on the original letter were the terms NH4903 and port, whose meaning I could only speculate until the actual event transpired. I'm sure most of us remember the explosion that happened in Beirut, Lebanon. Port signified where the blast happened, a port in Beirut. This one took me a while, but I figured out NH4NO3 was the chemical formula for ammonium nitrate, which caused the deadly explosion. There's a good amount of time between now and the last event, which should be on April 13th, 2029. After translating it from a numerical figure of 4,132,029, beneath it on the original letter, that I still have after all these years, the phrase 1997 XF11 and skin are written. I have no idea what they foreshadowed, and I probably won't know until the actual day. I've kept this knowledge of the future away from my then fiancée, who's my now wife of 14 years. We have a thriving company under us, along with a home and 2 beautiful children. The letters and their connection to Ashton's death are tied to a completely different part of my past that my family was not involved in and has no knowledge of, and I intend to keep it that way, until we met our new neighbor. They were a very nice couple from the Northwest that relocated for the husband, Corey's job. They have 1 child who's around the same age as my own kids, and they get along famously, along with a 2-month-old baby boy. Looking back, I think I understand now what the most recent letter I received meant. The name of my neighbor's newborn is Eric. The self-haunted man jostled the scraping limbs of wild and accusing foliage. The mud began to harden beneath the soles of his bare feet, stopping the flow of a crimson trail from being left behind. The voices in pursuit mingled with the slithering of creeping things and ominous cackles of predatory beasts. Had his intention been that of seeking refuge from the others who despised his life worse than he himself, the self-haunted man would have feared the shadows to which he fled. He certainly did fear them, but the darkness held so much uncertainty for his fate. He wanted those eyes of malice upon him in the torchlight. He wanted to cry out, "Here I am, let justice be done unto me, let your arms tear me away from this world." And because that was his true intention, the self-haunted man fled his captors, seeking safety. Were he hungry, he would starve. Were he clean, he would seek filth to bathe in. Were he to be confronted by gentle and good people, he would instead strike all with wrath unfounded. The self-haunted man sought now for his own destruction, to rid those that lived in this world of the hardship and desperation of any further torment from his corrupted mind. Or was it his soul? He hoped for the former, but he hoped for death more. And because he longed so much for oblivion for the sake of relieving others, the self-haunted man instead fled death for the sake of prolonging his own misery. The stars were gone, as was the moon. Blackness surrounded him, and his steps began to slow. It was because he now wanted to travel deep into the shadows, into the groping reach of whatever creature that found him appealing enough to sate its hunger. Slower and slower did the self-haunted man keep his pace, until he finally halted himself in a cold brook. Around him, the forest seemed to flee him instead. Even the wind made no attempt to touch his sweat and muck-soaked flesh. There was nothing but the moisture which stood in the air and on his breath. "Run," he commanded himself. His body did not obey. "Fall down and drown yourself." His body did not obey. Cry out so you can be found." His tongue remained still. "Help me," he pleaded, with whoever listened apart from his disobedient body. "Slay me." A light flickered in the distance for a moment, then died. A faded, clicking sound echoed. Then the spark erupted once more. In an instant, the wood was alight with the torches of a distant stranger, who immediately spied the self-haunted man. The figure lumbered through the swamp with great effort, and his form took on a monstrous quality in the rippling shadow from the flame. The self-haunted man began to back away, while the hope of his destruction filled within. Run to him, embrace him, fall to your knees, let him take you. His retreating steps quickened. He began to turn. "No!" he shouted. Sorrow filled his heart as the figure left his view, as did his chances for an end, when suddenly he heard the voice. "Flee from me! Be gone!" Horror caught hold of the self-haunted man, as not only did the words sound as though they were spoken from a wrath which haunted all the charnel houses, but his body stopped in defiance. The figure was approaching from behind him now, the squelching of mud from an irregular trod. The light of his torch revealed all the rotted bark of a desolate glade. The self-haunted man was afraid. He did not want to face this other. Somehow the thought of it was more frightening than the previous idea of the clutching abomination which lurked in the night. Yet, with these fears, turn he did. The figure hobbling towards him was cloaked in robes, smattered in grime and tattered with decay. The smell of him was vile, and the self-haunted man loathed even more his predicament, seeing how he would make no attempt to cover his nose. He breathed freely the rotten air. The eyes were the most troubling component of this menagerie, for they were alight with knowledge of itself and the world around them. This was a man. Somehow this walking desiccation was a man. The wretch spoke again, his voice softer in volume, but no less crippling to be heard, nor lacking in command. "Stay in that brook. Do not come on land with me." The self-haunted man disobeyed completely. He promptly left the cold, murky waters and stood with the wretch on dry ground. The wretch kept his gaze upon the self-haunted man while unshouldering a satchel he carried. "Do not sit." The self-haunted man disobeyed. The wretch slowly hunkered down to the earth before him and stuck the torch into the soft soil. He set the satchel into the small space between and said, "Do not open this." As not commanded, the self-haunted man pulled open the drawstring bag and found a large bread loaf and a water skin. He was relieved at the sight, even if it belonged to the wretch, but he knew that he could not make himself eat or drink. Then he heard the wretch speak for him to not do as he desired. The bread was delicious and filling. The only time he would ever eat is when he wanted to succumb to starvation. The water was pure. Likewise, he would never quench his thirst unless he gave in to death. The self-haunted man was restored, as much as he could have ever considered it possible, and yet he pondered the meaning of this charity. He wanted to thank the wretch for his mercy. He reached forward and smote this benefactor with a painful palm. The wretch looked back after the blow and simply said, "You're welcome." The self-haunted man was commanded by the wretch to stay awake throughout the rest of the night, to which he disobeyed. In the morning, the black veil over the foliage was driven away, and the swampland was revealed around the two men. The self-haunted man was glad to have rested so well, but despaired, knowing that he had the fresh vigor to unintentionally cause strife among his fellows. What were the reasons for sustaining the unsustainable? Why keep alive a flame which threatens to grow out of control? "You are a cursed man," said the wretch, "one who has set aside for a holy purpose, to which the evils of this world would know from your birth. As a child you walked in the moonlight, and that which is whole delighted in the sight of your promise. But she knew your strength was in your intent to help those who were hurting, to guide those lost into the light of the crescent moon. She severed your soul with a polished glass to which your reflection alone understands what you intend." Tears filled the eyes of the self-haunted man as he laughed at the wretch's scorn, but the wretch continued, "For you to do good, you must have to intend evil. For you to help, you mean to harm. To love without, you hate within. You could not accept this. She knew you could not accept this. But to want to do good, you would do evil." The wretch reached out and grabbed the arm of the self-haunted man. When he would have allowed this, he began to fight the wretch, struggling to pull free. He wanted to listen. He wanted to be a man sacred and a benefit to the world. But with the longing came the violence to free himself from the one man who could help him. But the wretch remained calm and held him tightly in place. The self-haunted man was embraced by the rot and stink of this vile thing. He was disgusted by him, even though he loved him. He did not want to be held by the corpse, even though he had fed him. He wanted to scream from the appalling sight of this most precious being that was able to see within and speak to the voice never heard. Instead, the self-haunted man ceased from the struggle, and in a brief moment of affection and self-reflection, he returned to the embrace of the wretch. His mind was quiet. There were no commands to be disobeyed, no intention to be fled from. They were the same, soldiers in the same army, fighting in the same war. He began to sob into the rotten cowl of the wretch, and the wretch held him until he stopped. When it ended, the self-haunted man stepped away from his friend when he wanted to stay. He walked on into the day which he did not want to face. He would be among people when he wished to remain alone, but his intentions were to be sacred, to be a benefit, to be whole. I've had it since I was a baby. Left on the porch the day my mother brought me home from the hospital. Box unmarked, but adorned with a shiny red bow. We were never quite certain where it came from. "That's Jack." "It sure is cute," my mother remarked. My 18th birthday was a few weeks ago, and we were cleaning out my old things. I'm going away to college next month, and Mom is planning on turning our storage area into a craft room. Actually, I've always found it a little unsettling, I said, my face wrinkling as she passed it towards me. It's got a certain peculiarity. I went to put it in the pile for the dump, but before I could drop it, she snatched it back. Absolutely not. I've always loved Jack, and you need a piece of home to take with you to your new dorm. It's not like you can cover up with your baby blanket anymore. She placed her finger on the handle and began to turn it rhythmically. The haunting nursery rhyme sound began to fill the room, and it felt like the music was seeping into every crevice. I knew what was coming, but I still couldn't help but jump when the clown burst free of the box that held it captive. My mom laughed. Honey, you have got to relax. I know you're stressed with all the changes coming up, but it will be great for you. Let's go get lunch, then you can come back to pack. She had a point. Moving away from home that I've always known did make me a little anxious. It's only ever been me and Mom. We've always been pretty close. I got up and went to change into some less grubby clothes for lunch. As I got near the doorway, something gave me pause. Couldn't quite explain it, but I felt the overwhelming urge to turn around. As I turned, I saw the clown staring back at me with its permanently sewn-on grin. Sorry, buddy, I'm definitely not taking you with me. I slowly opened my eyes, the sunlight comfortingly warm on my face. I smelled the distinct aroma of my favorite childhood breakfast, chocolate chip pancakes and bacon. Moving day is finally here. I don't let myself feel the weight of it yet. Instead, I hop up and make my way downstairs. There she is, the college girl. I thought you could use a little treat this morning, Mom said, coming over to squeeze me tight, her cheek against mine. I'm so proud of you, honey. Now let's eat. After breakfast, I showered and got ready for the day ahead. I felt excited and nervous, but not sure which emotion was more prominent. I had already gathered my things at the bottom of the stairs the evening before. I could hear my mom loading everything into the back of the SUV, so I quickly brushed my hair and went down to help her. Mom, I got it. You're going to throw your back out again. I lovingly nudged her out of the way before placing my belongings into the vehicle. After about 20 minutes of trying to arrange everything to fit, I finally solved the puzzle. All right, Mom, we're ready to go, I yelled across the house. It already felt a little emptier. I leaned against the wall, taking it all in for what could be the last time for a while. I was moving 5 hours away, and without a car, making it back home wouldn't be easy. Honey, look, you almost forgot it. Mom came down the stairs, holding the jack-in-the-box in her hand. Great. I wanted to leave that dreadful thing behind, but if it meant a lot to Mom, then whatever. I can toss it in a drawer or something. Certainly won't make any friends by leaving it on display. Now we're ready, Mom said, grinning and giving me a big hug. It was time to hit the road. It was November, a few weeks before my first college final. I hadn't exactly adjusted amazingly to dorm life, but I couldn't complain either. My roommate Sarah was friendly enough, but our relationship was mostly like an older sister, constantly trying to give her dorky sibling a makeover. Me being the dork, of course. You have to come out tonight. You've been studying way too much. It's only a couple of drinks with the guys. I won't take no for an answer. Honestly, you gotta get away from the dorm room. It's so stale. Sarah stared at me, waiting for a yes. The look on her face told me that I wasn't going to get out of this one. Begrudgingly, I agreed. About an hour later, yeah, it took her that long to get ready, we headed out. We were going to a local bar. It's basically a frat boy hangout. But I was content to have a beer and sit in the corner, pretending to have a good time before I made an excuse to head back to the dorm. The place was packed, full of students who didn't care about studying because they were here on Mommy and Daddy's money. Well, unlike most of them, I actually needed my good grades to keep my scholarship. Sarah found me at a small table and handed me a beer. Drink, you'll feel better in no time. I could hardly hear her over the blaring music and the chaotic crowd of voices. I definitely needed a beer to get through the night. I chugged it down quickly. Damn, kid, didn't think you had it in ya, Sarah remarked. I didn't either. I'm not usually a big drinker, but it was actually pleasant, so I ordered another one, along with some fries. It didn't take long before I started feeling what I assumed was an alcohol buzz. It was foreign to me. I'd never drank before. Was this really what it was like? Was I drunk? I felt out of control, floating almost. My vision blurred, and I could only just make out Sarah standing in front of me. "Where'd you come from?" My speech was a little slurred, but I didn't hear a thing, even though her lips were moving. "Huh?" She took my face in her hand and spoke loudly. I could hear her this time. "Let's get some fresh air." She escorted me outside the bar and into what looked like a spare parking lot in the back. It was dimly lit and a little spooky, but thank goodness it was quiet. "Be right back," she said, and then she was gone. It was definitely more spooky now that I was alone. I felt a hand on my back and assumed that Sarah had returned, so I spun around and it wasn't Sarah. Suddenly I was surrounded by 3 guys. The smell of cheap aftershave and alcohol mixed with nicotine in the air. Wait, I recognized some of these faces. They were the guys that Sarah and I had met up with at the bar. "Listen, if you're looking for Sarah, she already went back inside. Sarah told us you'd be here," said one of them. That was the last thing I remember about that night. Rather, it's the last thing my brain will let me remember. I woke up in my dorm room bed, scratches on my face and hands and chest and legs. My right eye has a giant bruise. My whole body hurts. I don't want to think about what happened to me in that parking lot. I didn't see Sarah. I wondered if she was hurt, or wondered where she was. I painfully sat up in bed. My vision was slightly blurry, but I could make out Sarah in her own bed. I grabbed her shoulder and gently shook her. "Sarah, are you okay? Please wake up." She stirred back to life. She saw my face and immediately gasped. "Jesus, kid, that may need stitches." That was it. No shock, no shouting. It was like she already knew what I was going to look like when she woke up. Wait, she looked perfectly fine. What was going on here? My mind started spinning back to the parking lot, back to Sarah leaving me to get back to the beer. The beer. You did this to me," I hissed at her. "How could you?" Tears started rolling down, stinging every scratch as they dripped off onto the floor. Her cheeks flushed, and I knew she was holding something back. I didn't know. They told me they were just going to scare you. I never meant for you to get hurt." But there's hardly any emotion in her voice. "Bullshit. You knew what they were putting in my drink, and you knew you were going to leave me alone in that parking lot. You're a monster." I stormed out of the room. I had nowhere to go, but I slouched down by the trees and cried. One of my study buddies found me there. Seeing Jordan's face brought me comfort. She let me come back to her dorm room. I was too upset to tell her what had happened, what I remembered and didn't remember. I fell into a deep slumber on my bed and didn't wake up until early the next morning. Jordan was asleep on the floor. I slowly tiptoed out of her bed and grabbed a glass of water. I needed to go home. I just wanted my mom. Usually, Sarah didn't wake up until 10 on Sundays, so I decided to go pack a bag and try to find a bus to get me home as soon as possible. As I began to turn the key for my room, something immediately felt wrong. I'm scared to open the door, but my need to get home was more powerful, so I did, and then I saw it. Jack. Jack was in the middle of the floor, still smiling his permanent grin. But how? I couldn't hear anything over the sound of my own heartbeat. My breathing was quick and shallow. My arms were covered in chill bumps. Then, oh God, I finally took my eyes off the grinning little clown and saw Sarah. She was lying in her bed, her throat sliced open. She was surrounded by a pool of blood, and It was still dripping down onto the cold tile floor. The sound of my heartbeat was now replaced by the sound of the dripping. Drip, drip, drip. The door was locked. The window was closed. Who could have done this? There had been no one in here but Sarah. And Jack. Drip, drip, drip. He's always been unsettling. But there's no way. It doesn't make any sense. Nothing makes sense. My breathing is even more shallow. My vision began to fade. I thought I was going to pass out again. I thought I woke up on the floor. There's barely any sunlight coming through the windows. The whole day had passed. Suddenly, everything came flooding back. Sarah and Jack. Where are they? I didn't see Sarah on the bed. I didn't see Jack either. There was no more dripping. Just silence. Even the bloodstains were gone. It was like she was never here. But I know what I saw. The thought of it makes me vomit onto the floor. I was shaking. The sound of my heartbeat filled my head again. I heard something else now. Something like music. I crawled towards the sound. I'd heard it before. My brain was having trouble putting it together. I crawled closer. It sounded so familiar. Then I placed it. Jack. The tune is now more haunting than I ever could have imagined. Do I dare inch any closer to it? I have to. I have to know. It's coming from outside the storage bin where I put it so many months ago. I slowly opened the drawer to see it. That grin. That red nose. Jack. I grabbed it and ripped open the door to the dorm hallway. I run as fast as my legs will take me and dump it into the nearest trash bin. I still hear the music playing as I walked away. I heard it all. Sarah's voice, my breathing, and the drip, drip, drip. It was December 23rd, and I was sitting next to my mom on the couch, underneath the quilt my late grandmother had made before she died. Christmas tunes hummed low in the background as my mom snored. The embers in the fireplace glowed red hot beneath the log that had burst itself in half. Bernice, our cat, slept quietly in the spot she claimed as a kitten. Home. I wasn't sure if I'd ever make it back after everything that happened, but now it was a few days off from Christmas, and life felt almost normal again. At least I had tried to make it feel normal. It wasn't easy. Those thoughts cut through the silence sometimes when you least expected it. Suddenly, my brain whispered a single name. Sarah. They never found Sarah. As a roommate, I was naturally questioned. I said I hadn't seen her since the night at the bar. I wasn't sure how I had ever come up with an explanation for the events that occurred. I'm not sure I know what happened. Sometimes I try to convince myself that I imagined it all. All I know for certain is that Jack's gone. Cast off to some far-off landfill, hopefully smashed into 1,000,000 pieces and burned for good measure. Doesn't matter now. All that matters is that I'm home. I let my thoughts get taken over by the sound of the fireplace crackling, Christmas carols, and... what is that? It was quiet, but it was there. I sit up on the couch and tilt my head back towards the stairs. I turned the radio off so I could hear more clearly. It couldn't be. I listened closer. There's no denying it this time. Jack. The music stopped, just short of the moment where Jack would come flying out freely from his metal cage. The house went completely silent. I walked towards the stairs, and suddenly I froze in place, terrified to shift my gaze upward. Do it. Just do it, I told myself. It's a stupid clown in a stupid box that might not even be there. You're probably just dreaming. Finally, I looked up towards the landing. Jack, the same grin as always, stared back at me. I felt dizzy and nauseous, my head pounding. I thought I might. I heard birds chirping. I opened my eyes. What time was it? I was just sitting on the couch with my mom. She must have helped me to bed last night. I remember having a terrible dream that the clown was back. What a nightmare. I really should see about getting in with a therapist one of these days. I made my way back towards the stairs. I wondered if Mom was up. It's Christmas Eve, and our tradition is always to open up a gift today. I'm really excited to see her reaction to everything I picked out for her. I headed down and walked into the kitchen. I startled myself. I keep forgetting Mom's kitchen redecoration included a very ill-placed mirror. I shook it off and laughed at myself. Then I saw there was a note on the kitchen counter. Honey, had to run out early for errands. Go check the living room table. There's a surprise waiting for you. Love, Mom. My Christmas Eve gift. I wanted to wait for her, but she clearly wanted me to have it early, and I can hardly stand anticipation. As soon as I entered the living room, I saw the box on the table. It was wrapped in snowflake paper and topped with a beautiful silver bow. I wondered what it could be. I secretly hoped there would be meticulously hidden holes to allow air for a new kitten. Doubtful. Time to just open it up and see, I guess. I untied the bow and gently lifted the lid off the box. I thought I saw what looked like fur. Could it be my kitten after all? I had to find out, so I fully removed the box lid, hands a bit shaky with excitement, and I screamed as I fell to the floor. My heart felt like it had dropped all the way to my feet. I couldn't breathe or think or function at all. It wasn't fur. It was hair. My mom's severed head lay inside the box, cold, lifeless marble slits where her eyes used to be. Her ruby red lipstick is perfectly in place. My lifeline, my best friend, my home. I felt like I was going to spiral into nothingness. I had to call for help. Who cared about the explanation? My mother was gone. Someone or something needed to pay. My whole life had been ripped away from me in an instant. I managed to pick myself up off the floor and stumbled back across the house into the kitchen to find the phone. Instead, I saw another pair of lifeless eyes looking back into mine. In that instant, I knew there was no escape from this. He was there in the beginning. He'll be there until the end. Jack. The town of Ingleswood was in the middle of nowhere, according to the map. I'd never heard of it before. Neither had any of my friends when I asked them before leaving. Even more strange was receiving a correspondence from a relation I hadn't spoken to since I was a young child. It had come out of nowhere, a letter proclaiming my great-uncle to be dead, and informing me that I had inherited a slaughterhouse in a town I had never heard of. A slaughterhouse, of all things. I might have thought it was a prank, had there not been a rusted metal key included in the letter. Somehow, part of me knew the key was real, and that it belonged to the slaughterhouse my great-uncle had once owned. The ownership had been passed on to me, for reasons as of yet unknown, and I would have to drive up there in order to settle the inheritance. Which is why I was currently driving down a long serpentine road through a dense cluster of trees. It was still early afternoon, but the sky was gray and heavy, casting a dismal pall over the forest. Shadows crept out of the trees and onto the road, making it difficult to see without my headlights. I shuffled forward in my seat, hands gripping the wheel tighter as the trees grew around me. I'd been driving for just over 3 hours now, and it had been at least 30 minutes since I'd seen another car. According to my map, I should almost be there, yet I hadn't seen any signs of civilization. Nothing but empty fields and abandoned, ramshackle buildings in the middle of nowhere. And now, this forest that seemed endless and labyrinthine. The tires hit something in the road and the car jerked, throwing me forward in my seat. I slammed my foot on the brake and the car skidded to a halt, gravel hissing underneath my tires. I glanced in the rearview mirror and spied a shadow in the road, and I couldn't tell what it was. Had I hit an animal or something? I hadn't even seen anything. I debated ignoring it and driving off, but in the end, I cut the engine and climbed out of the car. The air beneath the trees was cold, and goosebumps prickled the back of my neck as I walked over to the misshapen lump in the road. The smell hit me first, the smell of old rotten blood. It was an animal carcass, a rabbit maybe, or something. It was too mangled and bloodied for me to tell. Flies buzzed around the torn flesh, the gray glint of bone poking from beneath the fur. Whatever it was, it had been dead for a while. I stood up and shook my head, lip curling against the stench. I'd move it off the road, but I didn't have anything with me that would do the trick, and I'd rather not touch it without proper protection. I would just have to leave it. Maybe carrion birds would come and pick it up later. I returned to my car, feeling a little bit nauseated, and drove off, watching the dead animal disappear behind me. 15 minutes later, and I finally broke free of the forest. Muted gray sunlight parted the clouds, dappling my windshield. On the other side of the trees were more fields, still noticeably empty. I found it odd that there were no cattle around, no sheep or pigs either. What was the use of a slaughterhouse if there was nothing to slaughter? In the distance, I glimpsed a small cluster of buildings. It was more like a settlement than a town. Stone and brick and straw. Not the kind of place I expected to find myself inheriting a building. Had my great-uncle really lived out in the middle of nowhere? Was that why I'd never heard of him? The road turned loose and rutted, and the car jerked and bumped as I drove closer to the town. A small sign, weathered and covered in mud, read, "Welcome to Ingleswood." At least it had a sign. The place wasn't a made-up town after all, I guessed. I pulled the car to a stop at the side of the road and pulled out my map again. The letter had contained specific coordinates to the slaughterhouse, which, according to the map, was a little distance away from the town itself, on the very border. If I followed the road for a couple more miles and then took a left, I would arrive at the house. A flutter of nervous energy tightened my stomach. Didn't really know what to expect when I got there, and what I was going to do about the situation. The only reason I'd driven down here was to get a better understanding of things, assess the area, try to figure out what to do. Should I just sell the slaughterhouse, or should I move here? The latter option didn't sound particularly appealing after getting a glimpse of the area, but wouldn't know until I had a proper look around, I guess. I followed the loose gravel road for a little while longer before spotting a turnoff to the left. The remains of a broken stone wall lined the path, and I spotted another sign that was too rusted to read. Signaled to turn, even though there was no other car in the area. I followed the path through the sheltered wooden area until I reached a small house. It was more of a cottage, really, with white brick and a thatched roof. The place had an air of dilapidation about it, as though nobody had lived here for quite some time. Considering my great-uncle had passed recently, I knew that wasn't true. Beside the house was a large freestanding shed. A rusted padlock was chained around the door, and I knew without a doubt that the key I'd been given was the key to the shed. Did that mean the shed was the slaughterhouse? I parked the car on the grass and climbed out. The air out here was fresh and pleasant, a nice change from the city. Though beneath the fragrance of nature, I could smell something else. Something darker, richer. Old blood and rust and butchered meat. I threw a brief glance at my surroundings, my gaze skimmed past the trees and the field and the faint curl of smoke blotting the distant sky. I couldn't hear anything beyond the wind. No bird song, no chittering bugs. Couldn't hear cars or people or anything that would suggest there was a town nearby. I let out a sigh. Maybe it would feel lonely living out here. I was used to the city, after all. I grabbed my rucksack from the truck and fished out the letter and the key I'd been given. No key to the house, which was odd. I'd phoned my great-uncle's executor before driving out here, but apparently all material belongings were still inside the house, and the shed key was the only thing that had been passed on to me directly. I walked up to the cottage door and tried the handle. Locked, unsurprisingly. If I couldn't figure out a way to get inside, I'd call the damn locksmith out here, which could take hours. Muttering in frustration, I began rooting around the rocks and broken plant pots sitting outside the cottage. Whatever plants had once resided there were now withered and shriveled, their roots black and gnarled as they poked through the soil. I turned one of the empty pots over and grinned when my eyes caught a glint of silver. I hadn't really gotten my hopes up, so finding the key immediately lifted my spirits. At least now I could get inside the house. Leaving the slaughterhouse locked for now, I headed inside the cottage. The air was stale and heavy with dust, and my eyes immediately started to water. How long had it been since anyone had opened that door? I wasn't familiar with the circumstances of my great-uncle's death, so I wasn't sure if he'd spent his last moments in the house or not. That thought made me shudder, as my nose picked up the smell of damp and mold. Apart from some minimal furnishings, the house was mostly bare. I didn't know what kind of man my great-uncle had been, but apparently he didn't like clutter, and very rarely dusted. I ran a finger over the sideboard in the hallway and grimaced as a thick layer of dust clung to my skin. If I did decide to stay here, I was going to take a lot of work to get this place up to standard. The longer I stayed here, the more I wanted to leave without looking around. But I couldn't ignore it forever. At some point, I had to assess the state of the slaughterhouse and make a decision about what to do. I went through each room, casting a cursory look over the furniture and testing the electricity and the water supply. Everything seemed to be running, which was a bonus. I'd already planned to stay the night here, so having hot water and lights would make it a lot easier. Upstairs, I paused on the landing and peered out the window. At the back of the house was a field of brown, uncut grass and some stilted shrubs. I could see the edges of the shed beside the cottage, the old wood stained and weathered. In the distance, I could see the cluster of houses that formed the village. As I was about to turn away, I glimpsed movement at the edge of the property, amongst the tree line. Someone stood between the trees, watching me. I couldn't get a good view of their face, but in the brief glance, it seemed gray and hollow, like wax. The figure darted away through the trees and disappeared. I frowned, the unease from earlier returning. Was it a villager? Shaking it off, I searched the upstairs room. Large master bedroom and bathroom, a linen cupboard, a smaller guest bedroom, and that was all that was here. Like downstairs, everything up here was old and run down, and covered in a thick layer of dust and mildew. I closed the bedroom door behind me and went back down into the kitchen, where I'd left my rucksack. The rusty key to the slaughterhouse sat on the table, just where I'd left it. Figured it was about time to see what I was dealing with next door. Grabbing the key, I left the house and went across to the shed. The metal of the padlock was ice cold against my fingertips as I inserted the key and twisted it. The lock fell away and the door edged open with a creak. Shadows spilling out across my feet. I peered into the darkness as I gripped the edge of the door and pulled it open further. The air inside smelled stale and old. The same undercurrent of old blood ran beneath the surface. Drawing in a deep breath, I pushed the rest of the way in and stepped inside, letting the dull afternoon light filter inside. The slaughterhouse was nothing like what I'd expected. Inside was nothing but an empty shed. The wood was damp and starting to rot, the ground full of old hay. There was no equipment that you'd expect in a slaughterhouse, no cold room to store meat. It was just an empty shed. Perhaps it wasn't a functioning slaughterhouse after all. Then why had it been called such in the inheritance? Something glinted in the sunlight, and I looked up. Several large metal hooks hung from the ceiling, the kind that you hung meat on. But what was the point when there was nowhere to prepare it? Unless I was missing something. This was a plain old shed with some leftover meat hooks still stuck to the ceiling. I raked a hand through my hair and sighed. Was it a waste coming all the way out here? I shook my head. Not a waste. I still had to figure out what to do with this place, now that it was legally mine. Leaving the slaughterhouse, I relocked it and pocketed the key before heading back into the house. It was getting on in the afternoon, and I was tired from driving all morning, so I decided to grab a bite to eat while considering my options. By the time evening had rolled around, I still hadn't made up my mind about the place. There wasn't much merit in staying here if the slaughterhouse couldn't actually be used, and I didn't particularly fancy being stuck in the middle of nowhere. I could sell it, but not as it was. It would take a bit of work to get it into decent shape and make it appealing to potential buyers. The final option was just leave it here to gather dust, but it seemed like a waste. I had debated heading to the village to see who lived there, but after spying the strange figure watching me from the trees, part of me had been reluctant to venture too far from the house. Maybe I'd walk down there in the morning. As dusk grew outside, shadows encroaching further into the cottage, and a chill crept into my bones, I turned on most of the lights and went around drawing the curtains to block out the night. I wasn't fond of sleeping in unfamiliar places, so I spread my sleeping bag on the floor of the downstairs sitting room instead of upstairs. Using hot water from the kitchen, I made myself some instant noodles and ate them from the packet, listening to the radiator clank and groan as it rattled to life. Being on my own in a strange house was starting to make me feel a little unsettled, so I turned on the television to fill the silence. Nothing but static burst from the screen, so I switched it off just as quickly. With nothing else to do, I headed to bed early. I nestled into my sleeping bag and spread another blanket over me to ward off the chill. Fell asleep the second my head hit the pillow. I woke up early the next morning to the sound of someone tapping at the window. Blinking away the grogginess, I sat up. The room was still dark, shadows lingering around the edges. I reached over to switch on the lamp and stretched the crinks out of my neck from camping on the floor all night. What was making that noise? The curtains were still drawn, but I could see movement in the gap between the edges. Climbing stiffly to my feet, I walked over to the window and tentatively pulled the curtains aside, peering out. A beady black eye stared back. It was a crow. Ruffling its inky black feathers, it tapped its beak 3 more times against the glass before flying away. I watched it go, frowning. Dawn had yet to break, and the sky was still in the clutches of night. According to my watch, it wasn't even 5 a.m. yet. But I was awake now, so I dragged myself into the kitchen to get some instant coffee. I slept right through the night, but I remembered having strange dreams in the midst of it. Dreams about meat and fresh and bloodied meat hooks. No doubt because of the circumstances I'd found myself in. When I returned to the living room, I found the key to the slaughterhouse sitting on top of my rucksack. I thought I'd left it on the kitchen table, and seeing it elsewhere left me momentarily disconcerted. Had I moved it there? I must have. There was nobody else here but me. Maybe I'd slept less well than I thought. I didn't trust the pipes enough to have a hot shower, so I changed into a fresh pair of clothes and drank my coffee until the light grew outside. It was another damp, gray day, and the forest was as silent as it had been last night. Wherever that crow had flown off to wasn't anywhere close by. Once it was light enough to see by, I grabbed the key to the shed and went outside to investigate. I didn't really expect it to look any different, but maybe having had a full night's rest would give me a different kind of insight into what to do with this place. I unlocked the door, letting the padlock and chain fall to the ground with a heavy thump, and pulled it open. Inside was dim, and it took me a second for my eyes to adjust. As soon as I glanced inside, I froze, my heart lurching in my throat. The slaughterhouse was no longer empty. Thick slabs of dark meat hung from the rusted hooks, the air thick with the smell of fresh blood. What the hell? Where had it come from? Last night, there had been nothing in here. The shed had been locked, and as far as I was aware, the only key to open it was in my possession. How had this meat gotten in here? Who was responsible? I took a step inside, feeling perturbed and perplexed by the discovery. There was just under a dozen chunks of flesh, as lean and expertly cut, glistening red in the morning light. I wasn't familiar with meat in this form, so I couldn't tell you which animal it belonged to, but I could tell it had been prepared recently. All of a sudden, I felt unnerved and unsafe. What was going on here? This was supposed to be my property, yet someone had clearly been creeping around here last night, hauling slabs of meat into my shed. I didn't like the thought of that at all. As I tried to sift through my thoughts, I heard approaching footsteps from behind. My heart pulsed faster as I turned around, not sure what to expect. A group of about 20 people were approaching my property from the trees. The first thing I noticed was their gauntness. Like that mysterious figure I'd seen in the forest, their skin was pallid and their flesh sunken, their clothes hanging like rags off bony shoulders. They looked starved. "Meat," one of the strangers cried, their voices hoarse and brittle. "We have meat again." "We have meat again," someone echoed. "We are saved." "What?" I muttered, stumbling back in surprise as the group of people, presumably from the village, drew closer. "What's going on?" "You brought us meat. You saved us," the older villager in the front of the mob said, reaching out his hands in a thankful gesture. Before I could do or say anything, the villagers piled into the shed and began removing the meat from the hooks, slinging it over their shoulders with joyous cries. "Wait, what are you doing?" I blurted, aghast at their action. The man from before tottered up to me, his eyes sunken and his cheeks hollow. "Thank you. We're so happy the slaughterhouse has a new owner." He seemed about to turn away, so I quickly grabbed his arm, my fingers digging into his flesh. What is going on here? Where did this meat come from? A slow smile spread across the man's face, revealing pink, toothless gums. "You don't know? This place is cursed. See?" He pointed into the shed, and I followed his gaze. Fresh meat was starting to grow from the hook, materializing from air. The flesh grew and expanded until it was the same size as the others, and one of the villagers quickly removed it from the hook. I stared in bewildered silence, struggling to put the pieces together of what I was seeing. What was happening here? Where was the meat coming from? How could it just appear like this? "I still don't understand," I finally uttered in a hoarse whisper. Felt like I was in the middle of a dream or a nightmare. "The hooks give us flesh," the man said. "But where does it come from?" I said, shaking my head. "This flesh that never stops growing on these hooks is the flesh of the slaughterhouse's owner. It is your flesh," the man explained, his dark eyes glistening in the dimness. Behind me, meat continued to grow from the hooks, and the villagers continued to harvest it. My flesh?" I whispered, the words sticking in my throat. "What do you mean?" I looked down at myself. I was still intact. How could it be my flesh? "It's a reproduction of your flesh. This flesh never rots, never goes bad. It is as alive as you are." The man still wasn't making any sense. How could it be my flesh? How was any of this possible? These villagers, this place, were crazy. The longer I stayed, the more danger I would be in. I had to leave as soon as possible. As if reading my thoughts, the man placed a hand on my arm, a warning look in his eye. There are conditions you must follow. However, he said, his voice a low rasp, if you ever leave this town, your bond to this place will be broken, and the flesh will start to rot. My mouth went bone dry, the ground feeling unsteady beneath my feet. You mean, he nodded, when the meat begins to rot, so do you. Your body will decay and eventually perish, and we, the ones who rely on your flesh, will starve. You have no choice but to stay here for the rest of your life and feed us with the flesh from your body. This is your duty, he said, tightening his old crooked fingers around my arm. There is no escape. You must accept your fate or wither away, just like the owner before you.